The Valley of the Kings, Egypt, November 4th, 1922. A young boy working for a British excavation team led by archaeologist Howard Carter.
It is November 26, 1922. A British archaeologist named Howard Carter holds a flickering candle up to a small hole he just chiseled into an ancient door. Hot, stale air rushes out from the darkness on the other side, air that no living person has breathed in over 3,000 years. His patron, Lord Carnarvon, standing right behind him, cannot take the suspense. He asks, "Can you see anything?" Carter, barely able to get the words out, replies, "Yes, wonderful things." What followed would become one of the greatest and most deadly stories in archaeology. The boy king nobody remembered. Before we get to the curse, we need to talk about the man inside the tomb, because the truth about who Tutankhamun actually was makes this whole story so much more interesting. Most people today know the name King Tut, but before 1922, almost nobody on Earth knew who he was. Not because the records somehow got lost, but because the people who came after him worked very hard to make sure he would be forgotten. Tutankhamun was the 11th pharaoh of ancient Egypt's 18th dynasty, a royal line that ruled during one of the most powerful periods in Egyptian history. He came to the throne at around 9 or 10 years old and died at roughly 19. His reign lasted about 9 years, and in the grand story of Egypt, he barely left a mark. That, at least, was the official story. The real reason he was erased goes back to his father, Akhenaten, who was one of the most controversial pharaohs Egypt ever had. Akhenaten tried to throw out Egypt's entire religion and replace all the old gods with a single sun deity called Aten. He closed the temples, redirected resources, and rearranged the spiritual life of an entire civilization almost overnight. The Egyptian people and their priests were definitely not happy about it. When Akhenaten died, his successors were desperate to pretend the whole thing had never happened, so they went after his monuments, his legacy, and anyone connected to him. That included his son, Tutankhamun. Tutankhamun's name was chiseled off temple walls, and his image was scratched out of records. He was even physically removed from the official list of pharaohs. As far as the ancient Egyptians who came after him were concerned, he had never existed. But the ironic thing is that the so-called erasure is exactly what kept his tomb safe for over 3,000 years. Tomb robbers, who systematically raided almost every royal burial in the Valley of the Kings across the centuries, had no reason to look for a pharaoh they did not know existed. Because they did not know his name, they never found his grave. But there is more to Tutankhamun's story than politics. DNA testing carried out in 2010 revealed something remarkable about the boy king's health. You see, his parents were brother and sister. And though inbreeding of this kind was not unusual in ancient Egyptian royal families, because pharaohs believed they were descended from gods and saw marriage within the family as a way to keep the divine bloodline pure. But what they did not understand was what it does to the human body, and the results were severe. Tutankhamun had a cleft palate, a curved spine, and a badly deformed left foot, caused by a degenerative bone disease called Kohler's disease, in which the bones in the foot begin to die. So walking would have been painful and difficult. This explains why archaeologists found over 130 walking sticks inside his tomb. For years, people assumed these were ceremonial objects, symbols of royal power. The DNA evidence made it clear that they were nothing more than his crutches. He also had multiple strains of malaria in his system, detected in his DNA thousands of years later. The most likely cause of his death, according to researchers, was a combination of a broken leg, malaria, and a body that was simply too weakened by genetic disease to survive. None of that was known in 1922. But what was known was that Howard Carter had spent years looking for this forgotten pharaoh, convinced the tomb was out there somewhere. And the story of how he finally found it is just as fascinating as what was inside. The man who would not give up. Howard Carter was not the kind of person you would expect to make the most famous archaeological discovery in history. He had no university degree and no formal academic training. He was born in London in 1874. the youngest of 11 children, and spent much of his childhood with relatives in the Norfolk countryside because he was a sickly child and his parents thought the fresh air would do him good. His father was an artist, and the one thing Carter did inherit from him was a talent for drawing. That talent, combined with a deep fascination with ancient Egypt, led him to start copying tomb illustrations at the age of 17, working for the Egypt Exploration Fund. He spent the following decades building his expertise from the ground up, working digs across Egypt, teaching himself archaeology the hard way. He was not particularly easy to get along with. Colleagues and officials found him blunt, stubborn, and difficult, but he was also meticulous, deeply knowledgeable, and utterly obsessed with finding things that other people had given up on. By the early 90s, Carter had partnered with George Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, a wealthy English aristocrat who had developed a passion for Egyptology after his doctor advised him to spend winters somewhere warm, following a serious car accident in 1903 that had permanently damaged his health. Carnarvon had money and enthusiasm, but Carter had skill and determination. Together, from 1907, they set about excavating in the Valley of the Kings, the stretch of desert near Luxor where generations of pharaohs had been buried. For years, they found almost nothing of value. A few shards of pottery here, some fragments of linen there. The Valley of the Kings had already been picked over by archaeologists for decades, and the prevailing view was that there was nothing significant left to find. But Carter disagreed. He had come across small items, bits of pottery, gold foil, and jars of embalming materials, all bearing the name of one pharaoh, Tutankhamun. To Carter, this was proof that the man's tomb had to be somewhere in the valley. Nobody had found it because nobody had looked hard enough or in the right place. But by 1922, Carnarvon had had enough. He sat Carter down and told him plainly that he would not continue to fund excavations in the valley. Too much time had passed, too much money had been spent, and there was nothing to show for it. Carter, by all accounts, was almost desperate. He pleaded with Carnarvon to give him one final season, just one more year. He was so passionate about it and so convincing that Carnarvon agreed, but on one condition. Carter would personally cover the cost of clearing the last unexplored section of the valley if Carnarvon decided not to fund it himself. Carter accepted without hesitation. On November 1, 1922, Carter and his Egyptian workforce went back to the valley and began clearing the last remaining patch of ground, an area that had been left untouched, partly because it was cluttered with the remains of ancient workers' huts and was close to the tourist entrance to another tomb. The workers started clearing the debris on a Monday morning. By Wednesday, November 4th, one of Carter's workers, a young water carrier, accidentally kicked a stone that did not feel like the others. He dug around it and found that it was not a loose rock, but was the top of a step cut into the bedrock of the valley floor. Carter was called over immediately. They kept digging and found another step below it, then another. By the time Carter ordered the staircase to be refilled and covered to protect it until Carnarvon could come from England, they had uncovered the tops of 16 steps leading straight down into the earth. Carter sent one of the most famous telegrams in the history of archaeology. It read, "At last have made wonderful discovery in valley, a magnificent tomb with seals intact. Recovered, same for your arrival. Congratulations." Carnarvon arrived from England nearly 3 weeks later, on November 23rd. The steps were cleared again, and at the bottom sat a sealed door, stamped with the cartouche, the royal seal of Tutankhamun. Carter had been right all along. Wonderful things. On November 26, 1922, Carter, Carnarvon, Carnarvon's daughter, Lady Evelyn Herbert, and Carter's colleague Arthur Callender gathered at the bottom of that staircase to open the tomb. Carter used an iron spike to make a small hole in the upper left corner of the sealed door. He described what happened next in his own published account. The hot air that escaped caused his candle to flicker. He waited for it to stabilize, then slowly widened the hole just enough to peer through. As his eyes adjusted to the light, details started to emerge from the darkness. Strange animals, statues, and gold. Everywhere, the glint of gold. When Carnarvon asked if he could see anything, Carter could barely speak. What came out was, "Yes, wonderful things." What lay behind that door was beyond anything they had expected. The antechamber alone was so packed with objects that it took the team nearly 3 months just to photograph and catalog everything before they could move a single item. There were gilded couches shaped like animals. There were golden chariots, dismantled and stacked against the wall. There were chests inlaid with ivory and ebony. There were alabaster jars, ceremonial weapons, clothing, jewelry, and life-size wooden statues covered in gold leaf, standing like sentries in the darkness. In total, more than 5,000 artifacts were recovered from the tomb's 4 chambers. Tutankhamun's body lay inside 3 nested coffins, one inside the other, like a set of Russian dolls. The outermost 2 were made of gilded wood. The innermost one, which held the mummy directly, was made entirely of solid gold. On the mummy's head sat the object that would become the most recognizable symbol of ancient Egypt, the golden funeral mask of Tutankhamun, made of solid gold inlaid with lapis lazuli, carnelian, quartz, and colored glass. It is one of the most valuable and famous artifacts in human history. The news hit the world like a thunderbolt. Carter and Carnarvon became household names overnight. The newspapers ran the story on their front pages. Tourists flooded into Luxor, and the world's attention turned to this small, dusty valley in Egypt, where a forgotten teenage king had just been brought back to life after more than 3,000 years. The phenomenon was so overwhelming that people started calling it Tutmania. There were King Tut songs, King Tut-inspired fashion, and Egyptian motifs appearing on everything from jewelry to furniture to architecture across Europe and America. But behind the scenes, Carnarvon made a decision that would have serious consequences. To manage the overwhelming media interest and, to be honest, to make a return on his considerable investment, he signed an exclusive deal with the Times of London, giving that newspaper sole rights to report on the excavation. Every other journalist, including the Egyptian press covering the biggest story their country had ever seen, was completely locked out. The other newspapers had no access, and with one of the most exciting stories in the world happening right in front of them, they had to do something to fill their pages. What they came up with would take on a life of its own and would still be talked about 100 years later. Because then, just a few months after that extraordinary discovery, Lord Carnarvon was dead. The deaths begin. Lord Carnarvon died on April 5, 1923, in Cairo. He was 56 years old. It started with a mosquito bite on his cheek, picked up sometime during the excavation. A small, ordinary insect bite, the kind anyone might get on a warm evening in Egypt. A few days later, while shaving, Carnarvon accidentally nicked that same spot with his razor. The tiny wound became infected. The infection spread into his bloodstream, and within 2 weeks, he had developed blood poisoning and pneumonia. He never recovered. At the exact moment Carnarvon died, people later reported the lights went out across Cairo. It was a citywide power failure. Whether this actually happened, and whether it had any connection to anything at all is impossible to say, but the story spread quickly. Back in England, Carnarvon's son claimed that at the precise moment of his father's death, their dog, who was back at the family home at Highclere Castle, let out a terrible howl and dropped dead. And there was also the detail about the mummy. When Tutankhamun's body was later examined closely during an autopsy, researchers found a lesion on his cheek, in roughly the same place as the mosquito bite that had killed Carnarvon. The press reported this breathlessly, and people started to take notice. More deaths followed. George J. Gould was an American financier who had visited the newly opened tomb in May 1923. He developed a fever shortly after and died not long after returning home. Arthur Mace was a senior member of Carter's excavation team, one of the most hands-on participants in the clearance of the tomb. He died in 1928 of what was officially recorded as arsenic poisoning, though his health had been in serious decline for years. Carter's own secretary, Richard Bethel, was found dead in his bed at a London club in 1929 in circumstances that were never fully explained. The deaths kept piling up over the following years. And with each one, the story got more eager ears. Someone pointed out that there was an inscription on the wall of the tomb, a warning written in ancient hieroglyphics saying, "Death shall come on swift wings to him who disturbs the king's peace." The story spread around the world, and even Arthur Conan Doyle, the man who created Sherlock Holmes, one of the most purely logical characters in all of fiction, publicly suggested that invisible supernatural guardians placed in the tomb by ancient priests might be responsible for the deaths. People were genuinely frightened. The world had just watched a series of real people connected to a real discovery die in strange or sudden ways. The question everyone was asking was, had something ancient and terrible been woken up? How a curse gets made. Remember how Carnarvon had locked every newspaper except the Times out of the excavation? Well, the journalists who had traveled to Egypt expecting to cover the greatest archaeological discovery in history were sitting in the desert with nothing. So they did what newspapers have always done when they have nothing to report. They made something up. The famous curse inscription, the one about death on swift wings, was almost certainly invented. Scholars who studied the tomb in detail found no such warning written anywhere on its walls. Tutankhamun's tomb had no curse text at all. While some Egyptian tombs did include inscriptions warning against disturbance, King Tut's was not one of them. The inscription was a fabrication, most likely written by a journalist who understood that fear sells papers. And it absolutely did. The British Egyptologist Herbert Winlock, who was curator of the Egyptology department at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York and a close friend of Howard Carter, was so disturbed by the inaccurate reporting that he sat down and went through the record carefully. He noted in the New York Times that of the 26 people who were actually present at the opening of Tutankhamun's burial chamber, only 6 had died within 10 years. 20 were still alive. Of the 22 people present at the opening of the sarcophagus, only 2 had died. Of the 10 who were present when the mummy was unwrapped, all 10 were still alive. He published corrections, debunked specific claims, and pointed out that several of the supposed curse victims had no documented connection to the tomb at all. Their deaths had simply been attached to the story after the fact, with no real evidence. It made no difference, unfortunately. The curse kept selling papers, so the curse kept appearing in them. What really sealed the curse in the public imagination was Hollywood. Boris Karloff's film The Mummy came out in 1932, directly inspired by the Tutankhamun story. It cemented the image of an ancient, vengeful, unstoppable supernatural force rising from a 3,000-year sleep to punish anyone who dared disturb it. Once that image was in popular culture, no amount of careful fact-checking was going to get it out. But one particularly telling detail about the supposed curse is what happened to Howard Carter himself. Carter was the one who discovered the tomb. He broke the seal and was the one who physically removed Tutankhamun's mummy from its coffins. If anyone was going to face the full force of a pharaoh's wrath, it should have been him. But Carter lived for 16 more years after the discovery, dying in 1939 at the age of 64 from Hodgkin's lymphoma. He outlasted Carnarvon by over a decade and a half, and a lot of the other people directly involved in unearthing the mummy lived long, healthy lives. So the supernatural explanation falls apart the moment you look at these facts. But the thing is, some of those people really did die, and some of them really did die sooner than you might expect. So if it was not a curse, what was it? The statistics do not lie. Before we get to the real explanation, it is worth spending a moment on Lord Carnarvon specifically because his death started everything, and it deserves a careful look. People tend to present his death as mysterious. A prominent man, relatively young, dead within a few months of opening the most famous tomb in history from what seems like a trivial injury. It sounds strange, but when you know the full picture, it stops being strange at all. Carnarvon had been in poor health for nearly 20 years before he ever set foot in the Valley of the Kings. The car accident he suffered in 1903 had left him with serious lung damage. He spent the rest of his life dealing with respiratory problems. This is actually the reason he started going to Egypt in the first place, as his doctor told him to spend winters in a warm, dry climate because the cold and damp English air was genuinely dangerous for his lungs. So when a mosquito bite became infected and spread to his bloodstream, his body simply did not have the reserves to fight it off. His immune system was already compromised. A healthy person might have recovered from the same infection without too much trouble. But for Carnarvon, it was fatal. There was nothing mysterious about the mechanism of his death at all. As for the lesion found on Tutankhamun's mummy, the one in the same place as Carnarvon's mosquito bite, subsequent researchers pointed out that nobody could reliably confirm it was actually on the same cheek. Carnarvon had already been dead for 6 months by the time the mummy was examined, and nobody who had seen both men's injuries was in a position to make a proper comparison. The detail was reported as a confirmed fact. It was not. The other deaths attributed to the curse are similarly unconvincing on closer inspection. George J. Gould was already seriously ill before he visited Egypt. Arthur Mace had been suffering from declining health for years before his death in 1928. Richard Bethel's death was and remains unexplained, but there is no physical evidence connecting it to the tomb. The pattern, when you strip away the newspaper stories, is not the pattern of a curse at work. It is the pattern of a group of people, some of them already in poor health, living out their normal lifespans, while a press corps with nothing better to print attaches significance to every death that occurs. Except for one thing. There is a real, scientific, verifiable explanation for why some people exposed to ancient sealed spaces do fall ill, and it has nothing to do with ancient priests or supernatural guardians. It has to do with what has been growing in the dark for 3,000 years. The real explanation. Scientists who study ancient Egyptian tombs have known for decades that these sealed spaces are not just full of gold and history, but also full of biology. When a tomb is sealed, it traps everything that was inside at the time, including organic material, including food offerings left for the dead, wooden furniture and coffins, linen wrappings, oils and resins, animal remains, and human remains. In a sealed environment with no fresh air and no light for hundreds or thousands of years, this organic material slowly breaks down, and the microorganisms that feed on it flourish in ways they never could in the open air. Studies of newly opened Egyptian tombs have found bacterial species including Staphylococcus and Pseudomonas on tomb walls. They have found multiple species of molds, including Aspergillus niger and Aspergillus flavus, growing on surfaces and objects inside sealed chambers. Scientists have measured the air inside sealed sarcophagi and found elevated levels of ammonia gas, formaldehyde, and hydrogen sulfide. In high enough concentrations, these gases cause burning in the eyes and nose, severe respiratory symptoms, and, in some cases, death. Bats often inhabit the outer passages of excavated tombs, and their droppings carry a fungus that causes histoplasmosis, a respiratory illness that can be severe in people with weakened immune systems. For most healthy adults, exposure to these substances would cause mild irritation at worst. But for someone with pre-existing lung damage, say, for example, an English aristocrat who had suffered serious respiratory problems since a car accident 20 years earlier, the same exposure could be significantly more dangerous. None of this was understood in 1923. The science of indoor air quality and airborne pathogens was in its infancy. Nobody walking into Tutankhamun's tomb that November morning was wearing a mask or taking biological precautions. They were breathing in whatever the darkness had been growing for 3,000 years. This is the explanation that scientists and archaeologists have settled on after a century of study. But it was a case that happened 50 years after the Tutankhamun discovery in Poland that really sealed the argument. The Polish king who proved it. In the 70s, a team of scientists was given permission to enter the tomb of Casimir IV, who had been the Grand Duke of Lithuania and King of Poland in the 15th century. He had died in 1492, the same year Christopher Columbus reached the Americas, and had been buried in a sealed crypt beneath Wawel Castle in Krakow, where he remained undisturbed for nearly 500 years. 12 scientists entered the tomb to examine the king's remains and carry out restoration work on the crypt. Within weeks, 4 of them were dead, and the rest followed quickly. 10 of the 12 died prematurely. One of the 2 survivors suffered serious health problems for the rest of his life. These were all documented deaths, happening to a named group of scientists in a controlled contemporary setting. Researchers investigated and found something very specific inside the tomb, a fungus called Aspergillus flavus, growing in the rotting wood of the king's ancient coffin, which had been sealed inside the crypt for nearly 5 centuries. Aspergillus flavus produces toxins called aflatoxins, which cause severe lung infections. When the scientists entered the tomb and disturbed the still air inside, they broke up the fungal colonies and sent a concentrated cloud of spores into the air. The scientists breathed them in, and people with healthy immune systems had a chance, but those whose systems were less robust did not. This was the biological curse in action, documented, studied, and explained. No supernatural element required. The Casimir case essentially provided the scientific community with what the Tutankhamun case had always lacked, which was a clean, controlled example of exactly this mechanism killing a group of people in exactly this kind of sealed tomb. The connection was immediately obvious to researchers, and when they looked back at Tutankhamun's tomb specifically, they found that the same fungus had been there all along. What is living inside the tomb? The evidence for biological contamination in Tutankhamun's tomb specifically is not indirect or assumed. It has been found directly. When the mummy of the pharaoh, Ramesses II, was taken to Paris in 1976 for conservation work, scientists examined it closely and isolated 89 separate species of fungi from the mummy alone. Aspergillus was among them. Researchers who studied Tutankhamun's tomb found Aspergillus flavus present there as well. The conditions inside the tomb were exactly right for it. The wooden objects, the linen wrappings, the food offerings, and the organic material used in the mummification process all provided decades and then centuries of food for fungal growth, hidden away in a dark, sealed space with no air movement to disperse the spores. When Carter's team broke the seal in 1922 and opened the doors, they created air movement for the first time in thousands of years. Disturbed fungal colonies release their spores into the surrounding air, and spores do not have to be seen to be breathed in. Looking back at Carnarvon's final illness with this knowledge, some details are quite noticeable. Reports from the time noted that he suffered pain as the inflammation spread to his nasal passages and eyes, symptoms that match aspergillosis, the lung infection caused by Aspergillus fungi, particularly in people with compromised respiratory systems. His pre-existing lung damage meant his airways were already inflamed and vulnerable. His immune system was not operating at full capacity. He was, in the language of modern medicine, a high-risk individual walking into a high-risk environment with no idea that the risk existed. Carter, by contrast, was younger, healthier, and had spent years working in dusty Egyptian tombs. His immune system was better prepared for the exposure. The other members of the team who survived for decades after the opening were, by and large, younger and in better physical health than Carnarvon. This is why the curse was selective. Not because it was magical, but because biology is selective. Pathogens do not treat all hosts equally. They hit hardest in the places where defenses are already weakened. So, essentially, whatever pattern that might have been drawn by those seeking to understand the sudden deaths, science explains them all. So tell us, do you think the curse was real? Or was it just the most successful piece of fake news in history? And after everything science has uncovered, does any part of you still think there might be something in that tomb we haven't explained yet? Leave your answers in the comments below. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoy this video, please click on the next one on your screen.